When Cleopatra VII died in the summer of 30 BC, the men who beat her were the ones who got to write down how she went. Roman writers, working for the general who had just conquered her country, gave the world a poisoned snake smuggled into her chamber inside a basket of figs, a proud queen choosing her own quiet death rather than a Roman parade. No Egyptian source records it that way, and no physician's report from the time survives at all. What most people know as the story of Cleopatra is mostly the story her conquerors wanted told, and 2,000 years later, historians are still trying to peel it back to find the woman underneath. Subscribe if the record behind a famous myth interests you more than the myth itself, because what actually happened to Cleopatra is stranger than a snake in a fruit basket. Cleopatra took the throne in Alexandria, the Greek capital her family had ruled for nearly 3 centuries. She was a Ptolemy, descended from one of Alexander the Great's own generals, Ptolemy I, who claimed Egypt for himself after Alexander's death and built the city's library and museum into the ancient world's greatest concentration of scholars. 3 centuries later, Cleopatra inherited a kingdom Greek in language and court, Egyptian in the land it governed, and increasingly dependent on Rome for its survival. She was, by the accounts of her own era, formally educated and fluent in 9 or 10 languages, reportedly the first ruler of her line in nearly 300 years to bother learning Egyptian at all. She stabilized the kingdom's grain supply through a famine, minted coinage stamped with her own face rather than a king's beside her, and ruled first alongside 2 younger brothers she was required by custom to marry and share the throne with. Both were dead before her reign ended, one in war against her, one, ancient writers claim, by her own order, though the evidence for that charge is thin. At the Temple of Dendera in Upper Egypt, she had herself carved into the temple wall in the full regalia of a pharaoh, her young son beside her dressed as a king in his own right, the last such relief any pharaoh of Egypt would ever commission. Rome had already been circling Egypt's throne for decades by the time Cleopatra needed real Roman muscle behind her. Her own brother's regents had already driven her from Alexandria once, into exile on Egypt's eastern border, and she was raising a mercenary force to fight her way back when Julius Caesar arrived in the city chasing a defeated rival of his own. Cleopatra had herself smuggled past her brother's guards and into Caesar's private quarters, rolled inside a carpet or a plain sack depending on which ancient source is telling it, and made her case for the throne in person. Caesar backed her militarily. Her brother drowned in the Nile, fleeing the fighting that followed. He fathered a son with her, and later brought her to Rome as an open partner, a scandal Roman writers never let her live down. After Caesar's assassination 4 years later, Rome split into rival camps, and Cleopatra allied herself with the general who inherited his armies in the east, Mark Antony. The partnership was political before it was anything else. Antony needed Egypt's grain and treasury to fund a war against Parthia, and Cleopatra needed a Roman patron strong enough to guarantee her throne against her own ambitious sister. It grew into a real alliance of both power and, by most accounts, genuine affection, and it produced 3 more children. It also handed Antony's rival back in Rome, a young man named Octavian, exactly the material his propaganda needed. In 34 BC, at a public ceremony in Alexandria's gymnasium, Antony and Cleopatra staged what Roman writers later called the Donations of Alexandria. Antony stood before the assembled crowd and announced, first, that Cleopatra's own son by Julius Caesar was the true heir of the dictator, ahead of the adopted heir Caesar had named back in Rome. That son, a boy of about 13, was Caesarion. Antony then divided a string of Roman-controlled eastern territories among the children Cleopatra had borne him, seating them on thrones dressed in Median, Armenian, and Cyrenaican royal costume in front of the crowd. None of that territory was actually his to give away, and the ceremony was likely aimed more at an Alexandrian audience than a Roman one. 2 years later, Octavian seized Antony's will from the keeping of the Vestal Virgins in Rome and read it aloud to the Senate himself. It confirmed the same grants of territory to the children and asked that Antony be buried beside Cleopatra in Alexandria, and Octavian used it to frame a foreign queen's family as heirs positioned to inherit pieces of Rome. It was the clearest evidence his campaign ever produced, and he barely needed to exaggerate any of it. Octavian did not simply prepare an army, he prepared Roman opinion. His speeches and the poetry written under his patronage cast Cleopatra not as the foreign head of state she legally was, but as an Eastern queen who had seduced two of Rome's own generals and meant to drag the empire east to rule it from Alexandria. Rome never formally declared war on Antony, a Roman citizen. Officially, it declared war on Cleopatra alone, which let Octavian sell the whole conflict as Egypt against Rome, rather than what it actually was, Roman against Roman. The fleets met at Actium in 31 BC, off the coast of Greece, and Antony's ships broke apart under Octavian's admiral. Cleopatra withdrew her own squadron mid-battle, a move ancient writers frame as panicked flight and modern historians more often read as a calculated retreat to save what force she still had. Antony followed her out. Within a year, Octavian's army had pushed into Egypt itself, and a war fought in speeches for a decade reached its actual battlefield. With Octavian's forces at the gates of Alexandria, and his terms clearly meant to march her through Rome in chains, Cleopatra died inside her own palace on the 10th of August, 30 BC. The version almost everyone knows, a venomous snake smuggled in a basket of fruit, comes entirely from Roman writers composing decades after the fact, none of whom were in the room. Physicians who later studied those accounts flagged a detail the popular story skips. No bite marks were ever recorded on the body, and cobra venom kills slowly and in visible pain, not the calm, composed death the sources describe. A growing number of modern historians favor a prepared poison, taken deliberately instead, a method that fits both the timeline and a queen determined to control her own ending. Her actual tomb has never been found. Ancient writers describe her being buried alongside Antony in a mausoleum she had built near her palace, but the shifting Alexandrian coastline swallowed much of the ancient city under the harbor centuries ago, and archaeologists have spent decades searching sites on land without confirming any of them as hers. Unlike nearly every other pharaoh this channel covers, there is no grave goods, no mummy, no sealed door to open. What survives of Cleopatra survives only in what other people wrote and minted after she was already gone. Whatever killed her, Octavian got exactly the death his propaganda needed, a defeated queen choosing suicide over Roman captivity, the tragic ending his own poets had already been writing toward. He annexed Egypt for Rome directly, ending 3,000 years of pharaonic rule in a single stroke, and spent his following decades as Emperor Augustus making sure the official account of the woman he'd beaten stayed the only one told. The coinage, the poetry, and the history written under his rule all agree Cleopatra was a foreign temptress who nearly brought Rome down. Her own voice, her actual policy record, her 9 languages, survive today only in the fragments other people chose to keep. 2,000 years after her death, we are still reading Cleopatra almost entirely through the words of the men who beat her, men who had every reason to make her look like exactly what Rome needed her to be. If you could ask her one question the Roman sources never bothered to answer, what would it be? Tell me in the comments. Caesarion himself vanished quietly from the historical record within weeks of his mother's death. A boy Octavian could not afford to let live. That story is next.